name's Liam Reid. I'm Chair of Threshold, and it's really my pleasure to welcome pretty much an overflowing crowd, standing room only, here to the launch of Threshold's annual report for 2022. So first off, I just want to welcome everybody here. I want to in particular welcome Minister Kieran O'Donnell here. I want to welcome Senator Fitzpatrick, Senator Moynihan, Deputy O'Callaghan. I think we have Deputy O'Broin joining us as well, and also Dr. Byrne from UCD. All of those people will be at hand. We'll hear from Minister O'Donnell, and then ably assisted by our board member, Dr. Sarah Sheridan. We'll have a panel discussion then. And then we'll also, before that, we will hear from our CEO, John Mark McCafferty, about the annual report and some of the key themes that the report emerges. Also want to welcome a huge range of stakeholders. I see other Oireachtas members in attendance here. Dave and the staff of the Department of Housing, with whom we work very closely with, some of our NGO partners, other agencies, and also our donors who I see in the audience here, who really help Threshold to do what we do day in, day out, 24 hours a day, 7 days a year, which is to protect people in the private rented sector from homelessness. But I'm going to say a few words, but before that I want to thank probably the most important people in the room, our clients, but also the staff of Threshold. Staff of Threshold do an enormously important job in sometimes very trying, testing circumstances with people who are in very, very vulnerable situations, and they do an absolutely superb job. And I just want to thank them on behalf of the board and on behalf of all of our stakeholders, because without them we wouldn't be able to do what we do. And the numbers that you see in the report that you have here kind of speak for themselves in terms of what Threshold does. Last year we worked with 12,000 households who were at risk of homelessness. 6,000 at-risk cases closed in 2022. And just under 4,500 homes, that comprised around 10,000 people, were protected from entering homelessness. And just to give you an idea of the extent of that kind of emerged out of 60,000 individual telephone calls, emails, texts and web chats that our staff kind of dealt with and managed through. So, you know, again, we in the board were not involved on a day-to-day basis, but we always, when we're discussing it at board meetings, are always overwhelmed by the actual work that is done to help those people. It's an enormous amount of work, an enormous amount of effort to actually save any family from entering homelessness. It involves a huge amount of expertise and a huge amount of work. Also, we have a big advocacy. We have an advocacy wing to what we do, and Anne-Marie is in the back who runs that. And we grew that advocacy team during 2022, producing two key reports: the annual Tenant Sentiment Survey, and also Renting and Risk for the Citizens Information Board. And the reason that that's really important is that that helps develop the information, the data, and the insights that helps formulate government policy, that helps us advocate for the right type of policies to support the private rented sector to protect on homelessness. We also participated in key government initiatives. That includes the National Homeless Action Committee, the Housing Commission's working group on the regulation of rented housing, and even John Mark was involved in the Taxation Commission as well, really kind of bringing an insight into the NGO sector and what we believe the right type of taxation measures in terms of supporting good, affordable, high quality housing. It was also an important year for ourselves as a board. We developed a new strategic plan, and that strategic plan really aimed at restructuring how we work and how we operate. The reason that was really important is that, you know, we want to be very, very focused on the services that we provide, and we work to reorganise how we provide those services to ensure that we can do it better and we can do it more effectively as well. The other thing that we worked on, and it's really important for any charity, is on governance. Setting up new committees and making sure that we are properly governed and that we're supporting John Mark and his team in terms of managing the risks that are associated with any large-scale organisation. We also welcomed 5 new board members last year to the board, a real refresh. We said goodbye that year to some amazing board members who've been with us for a long time, who had amazing insight. But we went out in terms of the board members that we went out to ask to join us from a wide range. People with risk management expertise, people like Sarah with policy expertise, and people with private sector expertise, with customer care expertise, to really help and support Threshold in how we do. So we've been on that journey, and we will continue on that journey. And that has helped us set up to grow further, to grow our services further, but also to increase our advocacy, and we're committed to investing. We're just talking with Minister O'Donnell. We will be opening a new premises in Limerick in the coming months, which we're very, very excited about, but that is really about bringing the services to where people need them most. So finally, I'm going to hand over to the Minister, but before I want to do that, just want to thank board members for all of their support, because again, as I say, it's very important work that Threshold do, and it takes a lot of people, a lot of effort and a lot of time and a lot of work to do it. So that's all from me. I'll come back to close, and I'm going to hand over to the Minister now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Liam. It's fantastic to see such a huge crowd here. Can I first acknowledge our Oireachtas colleagues, Deputy Cian O'Callaghan, Deputy Danny Healy-Rae, same down there, Senator Mary Fitzpatrick and Senator Rebecca Moynihan. I think you referenced that Eoin Ó'Broin will be along as well. Can I acknowledge the Chairperson Liam Reid? I mean, you're very much struck, I suppose, what's in the report. And can I also acknowledge John Mark McCaffrey here with us as well? And you made reference to him earlier. It's really about the clients and the staff. You have a phenomenal history and record on what you do. And can I also acknowledge my colleagues from the department, our Assistant Secretary David Kelly and Catherine Comer, the PO, who you will be dealing with on I've no doubt on a regular basis. And I suppose I'm here today to launch the report. It's annual report 2022 from Threshold, Ending Homelessness and Empowering People. It's a very good report. It's worth our while. I was asking who did the heavy lifting, and Marie did a lot of the work along with, I think, the fundraising team within Threshold. What I particularly like is the human interest stories, and I think it's very important that I reference in there. You have Mary, Seamus struck a chord with me, an elderly gent in terms of housing. There was two Neves, there was Simon, there was a John Paul, a Carmel, and then obviously you had a nice piece from your assistant manager in the Galway office in terms of Graham. And really it covers, resulting when it comes down to it, in all what we all do, it's all about people. It's all about helping people. You've a particular body of work that you do, and in government we value the work that Threshold does. We acknowledge the work you do, more particularly in terms of advocacy for vulnerable groups, and particularly your Threshold, your Tenancy Protection Service, where you're effectively that advocacy service, and I've no doubt along with other people, we've used Threshold as our referral service. I'm a TD in Limerick for many years. You've been there, you have a long association with the city. You're on Henry Street, you have an outreach service through Assisted Information, and I note in your report you reference this is your 10th year of an association with Assisted Information Centres nationally, and I suppose I want to applaud that. You've helped over 5,000 people through that service, and I suppose when it comes down to it, how we support it, we're supportive obviously in intent, but more particularly in terms of funding, and we have been. We've been supported through the Human Rights campaign, which was launched recently. It's still up and running, and more particularly for the next year, 2024, there will be a significant increase in funding from our department for Threshold. It's something we want to support what you do, and that's a commitment we give publicly here today. You've been dealing with obviously nationwide, and Liam, you referenced Limerick. Very much look forward to you setting up that Midwest hub and Steamboat Quay, and on a full-time basis. I spoke earlier to Emma, who would be the manager of that service in the West. and you're looking to have that formally up and running by Q1 of next year. It'll obviously be, as I say, dipping your toes in the water in a soft way towards the end of the year. It's a service we very much value what you do in terms of currently with your outreach service in Henry Street, but this coming and setting up a permanent, a full-time operation in Limerick and in the West is something I applaud you for. Can I also, in terms of, and I suppose I want to go into the report itself, because that's what we're here to launch today. And then you made reference to the 6,000 at-risk cases closed in 2022. That dealt with over 4,300 households. That's nearly 5,900 adults, 3,900 children. That's nearly 9,800 people in total for preventive and mental homeless service. You made reference this morning, and it's something that John Mark, you referenced in your contribution, in your forward in the report itself. The 12,000 people that you on the brink of homelessness this year was an increase. We acknowledge there is an issue. We're looking to work with you in terms of increasing supply overall, and that's what will bring about really the reduction in the risk of homelessness. This year, for the first 9 months, we've had record completions just over 22,000. We are looking very much that we'll exceed our target of 29,000 for this year overall, and we'd look to exceed our target for next year as well in terms of pipeline. And that's, I suppose, the real trust. Within the report as well, he assisted 18,684 households, which John Mark, you referenced in the report. That's 53,000 people in total, 39,000 adults and yet just 14,500 children, of which 14,478 were households where a new case was opened, and of those new cases, 10,870 were seeking assistance the very first time. That's 3/4 of that number. It's very high. So once again, we acknowledge there is an issue, and that's obviously why we've brought in a range of supports. You, in your report, 47,000 calls answered by advisors, and obviously with the advent now of social media, 9,500 webcast queries, an average 38 per day, 6,800 people made initial contact by email, 197 online video consultations, and you represented, I think John Mark, who made reference to this, 278 households at the RTB, and assist 187 to submit disputes. We've looked in the last quarter, we've looked to, in terms of keeping people from either preventing from going to homelessness or exiting, we've just short of 1,279 people in the last quarter. That's an increase. We want to increase that further, but it's something we are committed to doing. But ultimately, when you go back to, it's about housing supply. At the moment, in terms of social housing, there's 22,612 units currently at various stages. On HAP, there's 160 new HAP applications being posted each week at the moment. Furthermore, the tenant in situ scheme. And there has been a lot of talk around the ending of the eviction ban. We want, and the tenant in situ scheme is working. To date, we have, looking at the total number, we're looking at over 3,100 cases are in the pipeline. 1,100 of those are tenants in situ. We've concluded. We've 1,200 in progress, and we've 800 at a preliminary stage. We want to keep people in their homes. Whatever their home is, whether that's rental, and the tenant in situ is where someone has an eviction, served with an eviction notice, and they're on HAP, that they will qualify for go to a local authority to purchase their home. Furthermore, we're obviously looking at putting in place a scheme for someone who's not on HAP, the first right of refusal. The memo went to Cabinet on the 26th of October. We're prioritising that legislation to ensure if someone is not on HAP or on the social housing list, and people will be aware To go on HAP, you have to go into social housing unless there's an extreme emergency situation. That the tenant then would get first right of refusal. We're already finding it is happening in practice, and that scheme is administered by the housing agency. It's something we really want to continue to promote. In terms of the additional measures we brought in, we have, as you're aware, we have the RPSAs. It will say in terms of 2% increase per year, or if inflation is less than that. We've dealt with new tenancies from the 11th of June, become tenancy of unlimited duration, has been 6 months there. Landlords must offer relet in certain cases that have ended tenancies. And currently we're carrying out a review of the private rental market. And I know Threshold have made a submission on that. That's in Housing for All. We want to increase supply and protect renters. We have increased the rent credit from 500 to 750 euro. We want to keep tenants in situ. We want to ensure that that they come and they get, if they're on HAP, that they qualify to get social housing. That's what the tenant in situ scheme is about, apart from the general. And we also want to ensure in terms of tenants' rights. And Threshold are the first port of call for many people to run into difficulty in terms of tenancies. We acknowledge that. We all refer you people to Threshold, and you provide a hugely valuable service. We expect that review will conclude shortly. We had a 6-week targeted engagement campaign, so we expect that report will be finalised quite shortly. And I suppose to finish up, this is a very good report. It's a historic report. In real time, you continue to do phenomenal work. We're very supportive of the work. I'm giving a public commitment here today that the funding for Threshold will significantly increase for 2024. We'll expect to have that agreed very shortly, so you'll have certainty going into 2024. We acknowledge the service you provide to the service users. I acknowledge the phenomenal work done by your staff, and really it's about working together, but ultimately when it comes down to it, reducing the risk of homelessness is all about increasing supply. We're doing that, and we're seeing increases across completions, commencements, and more particularly in terms of planning permissions coming through to ensure we can continue to increase that supply. And we look forward to working with you in parallel and partnership model to ensure we deal with the difficulties that people with renters are experiencing. We are seeing an increase in supply in the rental market, not enough, but there is certainly it's going in the right direction. But I suppose going back to the key theme of today, congratulate you on your report, and I wish you continued endeavours in the phenomenal value work you do for people out there in renters and ensuring people are preventing from homeless. Thank you all very much.
Good morning, everyone. Just to say a warm welcome to everyone, Minister, deputies, senators, to our funders. I want to mention to the DRHE, who are a very significant funder for us, so to welcome them. Our donors, our clients, our staff, our colleagues in the private rental sector. I'm just going to say a few things, because I'm really the big thing, the big conversation here is around the panel discussion that we're going to have shortly. So just to say, to start off with by saying that, you know, we commenced in 1978 as an advice and attempts rights organisation, and now over the last 10 years we've added to that canon our tenancy protection, homeless prevention role, and I think that's a really, really important point to make, that yes, we are a national charity, yes, we do specialise in the private rented sector, but we have a lot to say about renting more generally. And since the recovery, I guess the canary in the coal mine in terms of one of the first kind of signs or facets of a recovery was that hike in rent costs and the threat of economic eviction. and evictions have increased substantially through a number of different kind of ways and origins as a result. So I think that's really important. That tenancy protection work is vitally important. And as our chair Liam Reid said, 2022 was key strategically for us, and I think my role is just to say briefly something about that. We made quite a departure last year in that we did a deep, wide review strategically. We consulted far and wide externally, and out of that, in 2022, we developed a strategic plan which was around change, it was around transformation, it was around building our ability and our capacity to be more resilient for the next 5-10 years ahead and beyond. And it was also about our ability to be as responsive and as agile as we possibly can for a very mixed and a very dramatically, dynamically changing private rented population and their families. It's not fixed in any way. They're a very heterogeneous group, and we have to be really agile, and we have to know exactly what's happening from a data point of view, but also from people's stories, in order to respond to that and to design and develop interventions and ways of interaction, in ways in which people want to and expect to communicate with us. So that's absolutely key. So in terms of the outcomes, I just mentioned them because I think it's really important, because this is what we're focused on from 2022 right through to 2025. It's that tenants receive the advice and the supports that they need to thrive in a sustainable tenancy, that they're protected in their tenancies and homelessness is prevented, and that tenants benefit from the vindication of their rights and positive policy change which enhances their access to affordable, secure, suitable and good quality housing in sustainable communities. The strategy also aims that as further outcomes, Threshold is a highly respected and sought after voice on housing and rented policy legislation. And even this morning, the launch of this annual report is an example of Threshold, I guess, providing a platform, facilitating a conversation across elected representatives and wider civil society about the kind of private rented sector that we aspire to. Also that we are inclusive as an organisation, accessible and reflective of a changing Ireland as an employer, that as an employer, that we're an organisation for which every staff member is proud to work, that we're on a sound financial footing, and I very much welcome Minister O'Donnell's pledge there in relation to next year and onwards, and that we have a model of meaningful client engagement and consultation which is developed and implemented, and engaging our stakeholders meaningfully and knowing what renters need from us as a service provider, as well as what they want from the private rented sector, is really, really important and really timely. And that can only be, and the services can only be informed if we have a comprehensive suite of data and key performance indicators that are developed, embedded, and that are core to our culture and our way to responding to staff and to client needs. So just to wrap up, just to thank our board. They've been hugely supportive, and we've effectively a new board in the sense that we had a sea change of 50%, as Liam said, very significant change in board members, a very diverse board, a new range of very active subcommittees, and a really strong emphasis on governance, and that's obviously very key, more important than ever now, given current debates and conversations. And just to thank all our funders and our donors today. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Sarah Sheridan, our board member, who will chair the panel discussion with our elected reps and civil society organisations.
Okay, everybody, so we have half an hour to discuss a very big and broad debate So I would ask all the panellists to be as concise as they possibly can, but also to thank you all for taking the time out of your very busy schedules to come here and join us today and to participate in this event. And today we're here to talk about, the topic is, what does a sustainable and fair private rented sector look like? So I will invite you all, we've already introduced the panel members, so but I might just, again, just in case, we have Deputy Eoin Ó'Broin from Sinn Féin, Dr. Byrne from UCD, Senator Mary Fitzpatrick from Fianna Fáil, Senator Rebecca Moynihan from Labour, and we have Deputy Cian O'Callaghan from the Social Democrats, all of whom, with the exception of Dr. Byrne from UCD, all of whom is the spokespeople for their respective parties on housing. So it's a real pleasure to have you here today and to hear your own perspectives and insights on this discussion. So I might invite you all to just open up with maybe a 3-minute opening statement in response to the topic, and I would, as I said, urge you all to be as concise as possible as we're quite tight on time. We will have an opportunity for 5 minutes of questions and answers at the end of the panel discussion. So I might just hand to you, Deputy Ó'Broin.
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much, and first of all, thanks to be here at the launch, and congratulations to Threshold on another successful year. In the 30 years I've been living in the private rental sector, it has never been harder to be a renter. Rents are higher than they have ever been before, and they're continuing to rise, as we've seen both in the most recent draft report, but also we'll see in the RTB report the week after next. It has never been more insecure. 15,000 eviction notices so far this year, and if that trend continues, 20,000 by year's end, probably a historic high. But probably the most significant issue we need to understand is far too many people who should not be living in the private rental sector are living there. 90,000 tenancies subsidised through HAP-RASM and supplement. The vast majority of those people want to be in social housing, not in secure, expensive private rental. We have an unknown number of people, but according to one ESRI report, maybe as many as 90,000, who should be an affordable rental, affordable purchase, not the private rental sector. And as Threshold's report with a loan earlier as you showed, far too many people over the age of 55, an 87% increase between the last census and the current one, now in a private rental sector that does not meet their needs. And when I listen to the Minister, I'm reminded of the story about the man who sets your house on fire and then gives you a small bucket of water to put out the flames. Yes, the measures the Minister outlined will help some people, but they won't put out the fire that is the crisis in the private rental sector, because the government does not understand the central problem. For far too long, government has over-relied on the private rental sector to meet the housing needs of people who should not be in that sector, and the way in which it's then regulated that sector has made it completely dysfunctional. So what's the answer to the question that you've asked? 1, over the coming years, our private rental sector, as a proportion of the total housing stock, has to shrink. It has to get smaller as a proportion of the overall stock. Why? Because many people who are today in the private rental sector need to be in social housing, affordable rental, affordable purchase, or age-friendly. And that means the fundamental decision of any government is, do we start to ask the private rental sector only to do what it should do, or continue to over-rely on it? And therefore much of the answer to the question relies on actual social housing policy, affordable housing policy, and age-friendly policy. And not only are the government's targets not high enough, they're not meeting any of those. And then within the private rental sector itself, we need 3 things. First of all, we have to stop rents increasing on a temporary basis. A 3-year ban on all rent increases, existing tenancies, new tenancies and new rental stock is absolutely key. And from the end of that 3-year period, indexing rents and rent reviews in the private rental sector to an appropriate index made up primarily of wages. The second thing is we have to give people tenancies of indefinite duration. The government says they've done it, but they haven't. The eviction figures show that. And that means we have to move to a situation where sale of property is no longer a grounds for issuing an eviction notice. And the grounds upon which a property owner can access their own property through eviction is greatly restricted to very genuine cases where a property owner themselves are at risk of homelessness, needs the property after a relationship breakdown, or very clearly defined reasons. And the third is we have to tackle minimum standards. 2018 Nightmare to Rent was broadcast by RT, and a lot of good work by Threshold and others was highlighted. And we still don't have the NCT system to ensure minimum standards. They're the 3 key changes, but ultimately it's about delivering more social, affordable and age-friendly housing and shrinking the private rental sector.
Thank you very much. So, would you like to go ahead, yeah?
Yeah, thanks Sarah. And thanks a million to everyone at Threshold. It's great to be here today and be part of this really important conversation. I have very little time, so I'll dive straight in, and I'm going to focus on what I think should be the key ways in which we frame policy in the private rental sector as a whole. So ultimately I think there's two ways that we can think about policy for the private rental sector. The first is an investment-led approach, which prioritises the supply of private rental sector housing, and such an approach of course also considers protections for tenants and landlords, but it does so in a way in which ultimately the kind of hard constraint within which policy making takes place is that of enhancing or maintaining supply. The second approach is a housing-led approach, which is also concerned with supply, but which prioritises delivering housing, defined as in most cases consisting of what I call the big four features of housing: security, privacy, autonomy and quality. So it first and foremost seeks to ensure that all of the housing in the private rental sector meets those core characteristics of housing, and then thinks about delivering investment within that framework. So those are the two approaches. The current approach, and the approach that's dominated at least in recent decades, is the investment-led approach, and there's good reasons for that because of course supply is a key challenge. However, I think that approach is ultimately unsustainable for three reasons. So first of all is a kind of a technical reason. We have very little evidence about the impact of policy or regulation on supply. So that means when we do policy which prioritises investment over something like security, there's a lot of guesswork going on, which makes it hard to sustain such an approach, I would argue. Second, the private rental sector is currently too big and too diverse for us not to have a housing-led approach. Right, so we've 20% of households nationally, closer to a third of households in Dublin. Around 25% of families with 2 children are living in the private rental sector. So how do we sustain an approach in which those children are growing up without the security that their peers in social housing and owner occupancy enjoy? We've also got a lot of disadvantaged households, as Eoin has mentioned, in the private rental sector, with a large cohort of people who are receiving a subsidy. 40% of households are migrant households, and housing policy shouldn't be adding to disadvantage. It should be doing the opposite. And the third reason is a political reason. Given the size of the private rental sector and the diversity of households it's accommodating, I don't think that an investment-led approach is politically sustainable. And just very briefly, the consequence of that lack of political stability is that we've seen in recent years a flurry of policy measures that have attempted to give tenants some protections within the constraints of an investment-led approach. And that has led to a lot of reactive policy making and a lot of ad hoc or perhaps not connected policy making, too much change, and it has served neither landlords nor tenants. So my prediction, my belief is we will transition to a housing-led approach in the private rental sector. It's only a question of how long are people going to consider to live with insecurity before we get there. And that leaves two final questions that in my view should be at the centre of policy-making discussions. The first is how can a housing-led approach best sustain investment? That question. And the second question is how can we transition to a housing-led approach in the least disruptive manner possible, not generating further chaos in the sector. Thank you.
Thank you. Senator Fitzpatrick.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here this morning, and thanks for inviting me. I want to say particular thanks to Liam and Mark and Anne-Marie and all the staff at Threshold. You do really invaluable work, and you're a great partner for us. It's incredibly important that when people are living in rented accommodation and are faced with a threat to that accommodation and a threat to their home, that Threshold is there, and that it is an organisation that is trusted, that is informed and that is resourced to respond to them. Along with us, they're public reps. To answer your question, what we need is an adequate supply of secure, affordable rental accommodation. And to a certain extent, I know this is accidental seating, but the segue here was perfect because, as Mick said, what we actually need is a housing-led approach. And I suppose this government, when it came in 2020, there was a massive housing challenge. We all knew that, and the only debate was how we would actually fix it. A state-led approach to the provision of housing is how this government has settled on it, and it is the biggest housing plan in the history of the state, and there is 20 billion euros committed to it to deliver 300,000 homes, and part of that 300,000 homes has to be private rented accommodation. It has to be secure, private, adequate, affordable rented accommodation. It's not the only element of it, but it is a really important element of it. And to achieve that, capital funding certainty, you said that, Mick, the political instability is very disruptive for renters, most importantly. Short-term measures and long-term measures. The work that Threshold has done in terms of owning your rights, that campaign, the supporting the campaign for a right to housing, they're two really important campaigns that I've been proud to work with Threshold and for us to champion together. But in the short term, the measures that we've been able to introduce in terms of the massive increase in capital funding for social housing to significantly increase the supply of social housing so that people who qualify for social housing are not living in insecure private rented accommodation. The introduction of affordable cost rental, which for the first time ever creates really secure long-term rental homes for people that are affordable, that are adequate to their needs. The tenant in situ programme is one that I was a city councillor, I'm from Cabra, Threshold is in Stony Batter, but that came about because I was dealing with tenants who were facing a notice to quit, and I went to, it was Brendan Kenny at the time, Dublin City Council, I said, Brendan, this is mental. You need to buy these houses as opposed to paying for emergency accommodation. And that's how it started. Now over 2,500 tenancies, that's many multiples of individuals and families, have been prevented, not only prevented from entering homelessness, but actually have a secure, permanent home. That is one way, one really practical, pragmatic way that we're increasing the secure social housing stock. Is it enough? Of course it's not. But as we make the changes, as we massively increase the supply of social and affordable homes, we need to minimise the disruption for tenants. We need to minimise the disruption in people's lives. All of the pictures here, they're all human stories. They're all real lives. If you get a notice to quit, or if your house is, or your home is in any way undermined, it disrupts your life, no matter what stage in life you are at. So our obligation is to have the state take a massive intervention, which it has under Housing for All, to massively increase the supply of social and affordable homes, to ensure that there is secure and adequate and affordable homes for all of our citizens, and to ensure that our constitution is amended to reflect our values, I believe, as a society, that access to adequate housing is a basic human right. For a moment.
Thank you very much.
So the question that was asked is, what does a secure, long-term, sustainable private sector look like? And I think it's worth having a look at what got us here, where we have had such a growth in the private rented sector. And the policy of the last 20 years has been the private rented sector essentially being the key solver of the housing crisis from a government perspective. And Owen is entirely right. What we need to be doing is not looking at making the private rented sector bigger, but actually shrinking the private rented sector. Because what we've had is we've had a couple of key things happen. We have had a collapse in home ownership. We have had a collapse in the building of social housing. And then also one thing that's very rarely mentioned is that we have really low social housing income limits in order for people to be able to qualify for social housing, and then for people to be able to qualify for HAP. So we have a sector of people that are then caught in the middle, that they can't afford to buy their own home, they're in the private rented sector, but then they get no assistance otherwise. So the private rented sector is never going to solve our housing problem, as long as we want to have a housing-led approach to this. But what would a fair and sustainable one look like is where we are not piecemealing trying to keep landlords in the sector. And it's worth bearing in mind that when we hear this talk about landlords fleeing the market, and I hate using that word, what we're talking about is a group of people, maybe in the 90s, before house prices exploded or during the boom, that were getting buy-to-let mortgages. And those people are simply ageing out. They shouldn't be landlords. They never should have been there. They never should have been providing secure homes for people and doing what the state traditionally has always done in Ireland. So we have to take them in tandem with the growth in both the social housing sector again, I hope, and then the growth in cost rental housing, because I think that's going to be a really important part of it. And what we need to have for people who are in a rented sector, and I don't want to just say the private rented sector, is we need to make sure that rents are stable and they're in line with pay increases and inflation, because that's where we've completely got caught, that rents have been running out of control, and that the security of tenure. So the first and very easy thing that we can do for security of tenure is we make sure that we end no-fault evictions. So 63% of landlords who issued eviction notices were, the ban was the reason for sale. And I do think that it needs to be made clear to people that if you are buying a second property that's not your own home, and I think if you're living in it, we treat it slightly different. If you're buying a second property that's not your own home, you're buying it as an investment, you're doing that on the basis that it is going to be a medium to long-term investment. And you have to understand that the same way that if you invest in other things, and that you can lose on investments as well. And it's actually not the government's responsibility to guarantee your investment and entice and keep you in the sector. And I've had so many landlords who rang me to give out to me about my stance on tax breaks for the landlords or security of tenure, who essentially make out to me as if they're the solver of the housing crisis, and I'm like, you're not. You did this as an investment, and a lot of people bought at the very bottom of the market, and they've made their investment back many times over. And I think that's a really important part of it. The second thing is we need to undergo a retrofitting revolution. And while we are giving that to people who own their own home, to the SEAI grants on an individual level, it is really important that for people who are in long-term secure private rental sector, that they also benefit from that. Because you're talking about people more often than not particularly have tenancies who are low income. There's huge amounts of money that are then going out on heating that they otherwise wouldn't have to pay, and that we also have to make sure that anybody who is retrofitting their property aren't allowed to claim substantial renovations, hike up the rent, or have people leave. That there's a right of return for people and they're not allowed to hike up the rent. That is what a secure, long-term, sustainable private rented sector is. It's when people who are investing in it are aware that they're investing in it and that they're doing it for the long term, and that people have affordable rental that's in line with their wages, and they're not having massive amounts of money, because if you have a mortgage, it's more sustainable, that there's security of tenure for people, and that there's quality of accommodation. And there's one thing that I just want to end on that's often overlooked, but things like pets, furnishing your own home, able to make your long-term house a home, they might seem to be a bit superfluous to the debate when we're talking about security of tenure, when we're talking about affordability, but they're actually not, because they give people a real sense of that this is their home. And the amount of times, particularly for young children and families who have to make the choice between leaving their home and being homeless or keeping their pets, and I think that's dignity in the private rented sector.
Very much, Dr. O'Callaghan.
Yeah, I was just, and thanks very much Threshold for organising this event. I was thinking earlier, I was on the Government Commission on the Private Rented Sector in 1999-2000 that actually set up the framework for the Residential Tenancies Board, and I was thinking how much the sector has changed since then. So we've just come off the early 90s maximum level of home, a peak of home ownership levels in Ireland, where 80% of households own their own home, where less than 10% were in the private rent sector, and then 10% were in social housing. And the private rent sector at that time was completely different in terms of who was in it. So there was lots of young people in their 20s, maybe into their early 30s in it, people saving for a few years to buy a home, get a deposit together. There was plenty of students, like in Dublin, it was normal in colleges in Dublin for people to travel from any part of Ireland, rent in Dublin. It wasn't, now you look at a college in Dublin, it's people from here, the hinterland, the commuter belt. Very rarely you're going to see people from different parts of Ireland just renting. It's not a feasible option for them. You largely had people in the private rent sector who wanted to be there or were there for a short amount of time. Might have been waiting for a few years to get into social housing, but they weren't waiting 10, 11, 12, 13 years to get into social housing. So it was a completely changed sector. It's double the size it is now. And I think our aim and our goal for the private rent sector shouldn't be an ever bigger private rent sector, when there's people, you know, who want to be in social housing or want to be in affordable purpose housing or want to be maybe in affordable rental, and they want to have that long-term security that they're not getting from the private rental sector. Now that doesn't mean that we don't improve the private rental sector as well for people who are in it, but I think it should be those double aims. So the kind of private rental sector I'd like to see is one that is much more affordable and better regulated. For it to be more affordable, yes, that means rent regulation and the measures around that, but actually more importantly that means then what we're doing in terms of investing into affordable rental or affordable purchase or more social housing to actually take pressure off the private rental sector. That will have more of a calming effect on rents over the long term in the private rental sector. That's very, very important. And then on regulation, there's a huge amount of things that need to be done there. Also, the RTB needs to have more powers, stronger enforcement powers. But things like the deposit protection scheme that's been on, you know, there's legislation there now for several years but hasn't been set up. Like 25 years ago when I was involved in issues around renters issues, I was a student representative at the time, we were campaigning for a deposit protection scheme. Here we are 25 years later, we still don't have one, even though we're surrounded by countries with them. They're self-financing. In fact, they even from the interest of it, you can get extra resources that you can put back into the sector or regulating the sector, and we're still not at that situation. And in terms of security of tenure, no question but we should be like most European countries and countries with larger private rental sectors than ours, more stable rental sectors like ours, where if you're a renter that pays your rent, you cannot be evicted. That is the norm in most European countries. There's no reason for that not happening here, and I think that's an absolute of what we should be getting for renters in the private rental sector. If your landlord sells the property, you should pay your rent into the new bank account. That should be the level of disruption, not you've been uprooted from your community and your home. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Thank you all very much, and thank you for keeping it as concise as you did. It's really, really interesting, your different perspectives on it. And I just go back to, I suppose, Mick's point just around moving from an investment-led model towards a kind of a housing-led model. Do any of the panellists have any, I suppose, views around how we get there? What are the, I suppose, short, medium, long-term actions? And particularly around just Deputy O'Callaghan's point there just around regulation and the role of regulation. I'll just open it up to the panel.
Yeah, so the first thing we need is we actually need to have a housing system that is needs-based. So for far too long, both in the current government's plan and its predecessor, when they came up with targets, either the macro targets or the breakdown in terms of social affordable, they're not based on any meaningful empirical reality. Thankfully we have the Housing Commission. I understand that their report, according to the Minister's update yesterday, is delayed to next year. But that's going to give us for the first time an opportunity to have a fully independent and fully objective assessment, not just of the total number of new homes we need, but if I understand what the Commission is doing, they're also going to go down below that and objectively try to assess how many social homes do we need. Government says we need about 50,000, but actually it's about 140,000. Likewise with affordable housing, what's the actual level of need? Likewise with age friendly. And I think if you start with an objective assessment of need, updated annually, free from political interference or departmental interference, no offence to the department, but objectively established, then housing policy should follow that, because that will then determine what levels of investment, what levels of housing, and what types of housing are required. Because right now what we have is a government housing plan whose targets are completely arbitrary, whose social and affordable targets bear no relationship to the reality of what's required. And there will be, as a consequence, far too much reliance on exactly what Mick outlines is an investment-led approach in the private rental sector. Unfortunately, the private rental sector, where average rents are now hitting and doubling €2,500 to €3,000 a month for standard rental. So I think it's about an objective assessment of need, and then government policy then following that objective assessment and meeting it with real levels of investment and delivery.
Thank you.
So I think it's really important that when we have these discussions, particularly as policymakers, that we don't lose sight of the fact that it's real people's homes and real people's lives that the policies we're discussing and debating actually affect. And when we talk about the government's housing policy, it has to be recognised that one of the big changes Housing for All brought about is, and I see Councillor Dermot Lacey there and there may be other councillors in the room, is giving power back to local authorities. And local authorities are closest to their communities, closest to where people live. And the local authorities under Housing for All create what are now housing needs assessments. And that means for the first time local authorities are actually defining what is the housing need, not just for social housing, but for private housing, for affordable housing within their local authority area. And those plans are used to inform what government funds. And the Housing for All was based on the best available information at the time. If Sinn Féin or anybody else had been in government, they wouldn't have had any better data. It was the census that was available, and the targets are being reviewed. But what's most important is that we actually made a commitment to have a massive state intervention to significantly increase the funding for social and affordable housing. A state intervention to increase that supply of social and affordable secure homes, and that is sustained, and that we don't disrupt and make what is a precarious situation for some worse. And the affordable cost rental model is one that has been operating in Vienna for decades. 60% of the population of Vienna lives in public housing. They live in public housing because it's good quality, it's secure, it's affordable, it meets their needs. Now, to go from our legacy, as Rebecca and others have described, of 10, 20 years of undersupply, of a private rental sector that was basically funded by individuals who bought homes to use them as their pension, to transition from that to a model where it's a largely state-supported, state-funded, secure, affordable rental accommodation is not going to happen overnight. But we have to commit to it, we have to fund it, and we have to transition in a competent and sustained way. Otherwise, we're messing with people's lives, we're messing with their homes, and that's unconscionable and it's unsupportable.
Thank you.
Yeah, just a brief point. I mean, there isn't a country in Europe where there's a good, strong housing-led approach rather than investment-led approach on housing, where that isn't done through strong local government. And that is, Vienna has very strong local government. That's how they've delivered over decades lots of housing. And that's utterly different to the situation in Ireland. We've one of the weakest forms of local government in the OECD and in the European Union. We're right down the bottom of the OECD along with Belarus. So if we're serious about housing, housing-led approach has to be about giving local authorities the ability to do that. They don't have it. Now, anyone involved in housing delivery will tell you that. They go through this incredibly bureaucratic process to try and get sign-off on any housing delivery projects. I saw it when I was on the Fingal County Council. I was on the Traveller Accommodation Programme Committee. We never got a no from the department on any of the proposals that we put in for traveller accommodation. We just didn't get a reply for maybe 9 months, and then they'd come back asking me a few questions. We'd reply, wait another 6 months, 9 months. So you never got a no on the housing we were trying to build. We weren't getting the yeses either, and we weren't, council wasn't able to deliver its targets as quickly as it should have been. And this is going across different social housing. We bring it up in the Dáil with Minister Eoin Ó'Broin quite frequently about the 4-stage approval process and how that needs to go. Local authorities have to have their hands untied, be given the funding, be given the targets, and get on with it, be that for social, affordable or cost rental. And that is key, I think, in terms of delivering and having a housing-led approach.
Yeah, I think we need to be looking at it very, very long term, and I think what we have done is we've done it in a kind of a piecemeal way. I remember very clearly back in the 2000s, I think Nola Hearn was Minister for Housing, and I remember very clearly on the radio saying, well, actually the state doesn't need to be doing this anymore because we're building so much housing, so actually we can just fund people to do them. Cian and Mary both hit on two important points when it comes to the Vienna, or essentially a long-term housing model. There's two things that are involved in that. It's strong local government, that local government are empowered to do that, or the LDA. I think for a country the size of Ireland, an organisation like the LDA could be a game changer in terms of developing state land. It's not just local authorities who own land. The OPW owns loads of land. The prison service own loads of land. We need to be picking and parcelling up that state land. But also that we look at it long term and that we don't sell off housing, because that's one of the things I find it extraordinary and extraordinary that areas that I represent, so Ballyfermot, Crumlin, that the state is paying so much to private landlords to pay them in half to local authority housing that used to be social housing that was built by the state, and only one generation benefited from that. Only one generation benefited from doing that. And we need to make sure that we protect ourselves and we have a long-term state owned housing programme for people to be there and live in. And that's one of the key mistakes that we made in the past, was that we sold off far too much of our state housing stock. And so actually what we did is we put it in the private rented sector when it was built by the state, and it still should be in state hands.
Finish off and just considering was your point originally.
Yeah, I'd just say briefly, there's a lot that could be said about this issue, but just briefly, I think first of all, as a researcher, I feel it behoves me to point out that we don't have enough research and evidence as we would like to be able to think about these things clearly. Now, there's been great work done through research commissioned by and supported by Threshold in recent years, and great work from the RTV in recent years. So we do know a lot more now, but there's just limits there. So that's one point. And then briefly, I think in terms of affordability, I think a lot has been done, and I'm a little bit cautious about the extent to which policy in the private rental sector could do more in that space. I think affordability is probably best addressed outside of private rental sector regulation in going forward. So I think the nub of the question is security. And the key issue here is that, as I see it, is that security is fundamental for tenants, and we can't keep fudging that question. But landlords need to be able to recover their property as well. I think that's my view. So I think therefore what needs to happen is the tenancies of a defined period, probably the 6 years, which is the current tenancy term, in which there is absolutely no way a tenant can be evicted unless they're rent arrears or breach of tenant obligation stuff, but no fault evictions. But at the end of the 6 years, landlords have the opportunity to recover their property. I would suggest that is the appropriate balance given the nature and the makeup of the Irish rental sector. With that, I would say I do think that there is some scope for thinking a little bit in terms of two private rental sectors. So one as a mainstream private rental sector, which is, let's say, investment driven, right? In which we should be trying to achieve those things in terms of security and privacy and all the stuff we've been talking about. But we also have another private rental sector, which is the accidental so-called private rental sector. And so those are situations in which, for example, somebody goes to work in another country for a short period, somebody moves in with a partner and has a property therefore that they're not sure what they're going to do with long term, or the property is in probate, all these types of issues. That type of housing, it will be very difficult to get that housing into the private rental sector if there is long-term security for tenants, for obvious reasons. So I think it's worth exploring whether or not households should have the opportunity to apply for a one-off licence to be able to rent out such properties on a short-term basis, where they would be able to recover the property when they need it back, but that this be strictly limited, something maybe households can only apply for once in their lifetime, or which a given property can only have this option once or whatever. Because what we're trying to do at the moment is we're essentially keeping regulation weaker than it needs to be in order to keep a small cohort of accidental landlords in the sector. But there's a lot of tenants that are penalised for that, even though their landlords might be medium to long term landlords that don't actually need to recover their property in such a flexible way. That makes sense.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Thank you all very much for your very thoughtful, considered and very constructive insights into the question, and thank you all very much for your participation today.
That was super interesting, challenging, provocative. I'm going to make two commitments here. So one thing is that this debate is incredibly valuable, and I'm really conscious we weren't able to open it up because we made a commitment to finish at 12 to allow very busy people back to the town. But we will do something like this in the new year, particularly as we're moving into an election period, because I think opening up this debate and opening up this conversation in respectful ways as you look is absolutely critical to finding those pathways to real clear solutions. So a huge thank you to the panel for really provocative, thought-provoking and considered responses. Big thanks to the Minister, to his staff, David and the staff, and DRHE, and to all of you for giving us your time, and hopefully you got something out of that. So thank you very much, and I'll bring it to a close now.